shaping the Christian view of Jews, there are really three components. There was the theological, that we noted primarily in the ideas of St. Augustine and John Chrysostom of Antioch. Secondly, there's the political status of Jews. And third, there's the popular image of Jews. Now, the political and the practical we haven't talked to very much, but I want to begin with that now. Augustine, his notion is more than any other among the early church fathers, were woven into the fabric of state law. The simple fact is, we see a balance between the Roman notion of Judaism as a legal religion with the Christian notion of Jews who are to be tolerated according to the terms of St. Augustine. But what would that look like in practical terms? Theodosian was a Western Roman emperor in the 6th century. Justinian was a Byzantine emperor also in the 6th century. And they're useful to us because each of them, during their own reign, they enacted a sweeping code of law. They were trying to consolidate or bring order to what had been a very chaotic situation. Code Theodosius and the Code Justinian, most of it has nothing to do with Jews whatsoever. It covers a broad range of issues: politics, economics, culture, society, lots of different peoples. The main goal of each one of these codes is to transform what had been a Roman state into a Christian state. But they're great examples of how St. Augustine's theological understanding of Jews was transformed into an administrative and a political understanding of Jews. Novella number 5. No Jews shall obtain offices or dignities. To none shall the administration of city service be permitted, nor shall anyone exercise the office of a defender of the city, an overseer of the city. Now let's pause here for a second and ask. Sometimes laws are designed to be agents of change, to create a situation. But in some cases, including this one, a law or a decree is a reflection of a situation, in addition to trying to change it. So the fact that the Code Theodosius said, no Jew shall obtain office and dignity, to none shall the administration of city service be permitted, nor shall any exercise the officer of the defender of the city. What does that tell us about the situation prior to the enactment of that law? There were Jews who were holding public office, because if there were no Jews holding public office, why would an imperial code have to say no Jews can hold public office? Does that make sense? It's like in this country, there were no speed limit signs until it became clear that a lot of people were driving way too fast. But sometimes, and certainly I think in this case, a regulation, a law, is not only going to try to create a situation, it's going to respond to a situation that was already taking place, that was deemed unacceptable. No Jew shall be overseers. Indeed, we believe it sinful that the enemies of the heavenly majesty and of Roman laws should become executors of our laws, the administration of which they have slyly obtained, and that they, fortified by the authority of the acquired rank, should have the power to judge or decide as they wish against Christians. In other words, any Jew in a position of superiority or authority over a Christian. Now remember, previous under Roman rule, before Rome was Christian, you would find Jews in positions of authority over Christians. But the Code Theodosius is saying no longer. Jews must be inferior. This isn't a legal pronouncement, only a legal pronouncement. What was the theological basis based on, let's say, Augustine? What would be the theological basis of saying that Jews cannot be in a position of authority over Christians? They must be subservient. An example of politicizing or transforming a theological idea into a more practical political law or statute. Now, Code Justinian also is interesting. It's Novella 146. Not about the political status of Jews, though he covers it elsewhere. He's going to speak about the rights of Jews to exist as a community. We therefore sanction that wherever there is a Hebrew congregation, those who wish it may in their synagogues read the sacred books to those who are present, in Greek or even in Latin or any other tongue, meaning that Jews have the right to read the Torah as part of a synagogue service. Now, the reading of the Torah in the synagogue service, this is the heart and soul of the synagogue service. Code Justinian is saying Jews are allowed to have synagogues, they're allowed to pray as Jews, and this is a way of saying a Jewish community is allowed to exist. However, thus there shall be no opportunity for their interpreters who make use only of the Hebrew to corrupt it in any way, like since the ignorance of the public conceals their depravity. You know, they want Jews, they want to encourage Jews to include Latin and Greek and Hebrew in their service. So remember, the Hebrew of the Hebrew Scripture is preserved from generation to generation. That's another Augustinian idea. So yes, Judaism is an acceptable part of this Christian society, but we are going to place a limit. That balance that's being struck, both in the Code Theodosius and the Code Justinian, reflects this balance between the theological and political. Now, there were instances where, in the early 9th century, there was a Catholic priest whose name was Bodo. He became Eliezer the Jew. It was a real scandal. The church believed that Christianity was the superior religion, that anyone who understood it wouldn't give it up. But here, not only is a Catholic priest giving up Christianity, he's opting for Judaism instead. And the response to this, there were Christian clergy who felt the reason for this is A, there's too much contact between Christians and Jews. He knew too many Jews and they influenced him, but also Jews are not suffering enough. Jews are thriving enough to be attractive to someone who's Christian. And a Christian clergyman who spoke out against Jews was a French clergyman whose name was Agobard of Lyon. In the year 826, he writes a letter to the King of France, who's Louis I, who's also known as Louis the Pious. But he had his Jewish subjects. This is what Agobard writes. To his most Christian, truly pious, and always august Emperor Louis, they showed themselves, I mean you and your predecessors, to be terrible to the Christians and mild to the Jews, especially in Lyon, where they set up a persecuting faction against the church, and they goaded the church to many groans, sighs, and tears. When the Jews first arrived, they gave me a message in your name, and another one to the man who rules the district of Lyon, ordered him to offer aid to the Jews against me. We absolutely did not believe that such message as these issued from your judgment, although they were read out in your sacred name and sealed with your ring. And here's the remarkable part, because Agobard was a leading Christian clergy, an influential person, and Louis the Pious basically said in a word, and the answer is very lengthy. In a word, he said, no. It's my right to treat Jews as I please. In my opinion, what you describe as being mild, I'm still fulfilling Augustine's instruction to make sure Jews are suffering. They're not thriving too much. They're not prosperous. They're still restricted in certain ways. But I'm not going to be antagonistic the way you want to. The point being that the balance between the theological and the political created a situation for Jews in medieval Christian Europe that was stable. You can plan accordingly, and that's exactly what these small Jewish communities did. They were able to plan accordingly. This was the direction that the status of Jews in this part of Europe was moving. It was a little bit different on the frontier of Christian Europe. Living on the frontier tends to be either exceptionally good or exceptionally bad. Spain was the end of the world as far as these people knew. Remember, they haven't discovered the new world. They hadn't moved beyond the Atlantic Ocean yet. We have this interesting moment in Spain in terms of the attitudes of Christians towards Jews from one of the first church councils, which was the Council of Elvira in the year 309. But they're having some trouble. So there are 4 canons that deal with Jews. Now let's recall, this is another one of those instances where law reflects a certain reality. So let me read you what these canons say, and you tell me what's the reality in terms of Jewish-Christian relations or attitude towards Jews that these canons reflect. Canon number 16. Heretics shall not be joined in marriage with Catholic girls unless they accept the Catholic faith. Jews cannot marry Christians. What's the reality that's reflecting? Jews and Christians were marrying each other. It made the law necessary. Number 49, this is my personal favorite. Landlords, meaning Christian landlords, are not allowed to have Jews bless the crops they have received from God and for which they have offered thanks. Canon 50, if any cleric or layperson, meaning any Christian, eats with Jews, he or she shall be kept from communion as a way of correction. Eating seems something very mundane, but it's also an example of what we would call social intimacy. Clearly, according to the Council of Elvira, the situation on this frontier, Jews were too much being welcomed into Christian society. And the concern of this council reflects the later concern of Adalbert of Lyon. Here's the flip side. In the year 586 CE, Spain was conquered by a group known as the Visigoths. Now, the Visigoths were not only Christians, they were hardcore fundamentalist Christians. They were really strict about their Christianity. And when they took over in Spain, they enacted what came to be known as the Visigothic Code. Basically made all of Visigothic Spain strict. There were a lot more restrictions on what people could and couldn't do. The Visigothic Code, it banned Jews from doing basic things about being Jewish. It banned Jews from prayer. It banned Jews from observing the Sabbath, from eating kosher food. Saying you're not allowed to be Jewish, that's contrary to what St. Augustine said. Augustine said Jews have the right to be here. And eventually the Visigoths are going to say, not only is it permissible to place restrictions on Jews, they're going to say it's okay to kill them, to attack them as well. Prior to the First Crusade, in other words, prior to 1096, that was more the rule than the exception. The situation of Jews everywhere, except Visigothic Spain, which is important, had stabilized. And if you want an example of the situation, we have it in a charter that was given to Jews by Bishop Rudiger of Speyer. Now, Speyer, it's in a part of Germany, today we call these Jews Ashkenazic Jews. Now, let me give you a little bit of backstory to Bishop Rudiger of Speyer. He was not only a religious leader, but also the political leader. There were no Jews in Speyer yet. This is the year 1084. But not far away, there was a Jewish community in a town called Mainz. This Jewish community had been there for about 100 years. There was a fire in the city of Mainz. A lot of the city was burned down. And a lot of them, looking for a place to live, go and live in Speyer. The bishop gave them this charter of privileges and obligations. In the name of the Holy and Indivisible Trinity, I, Rudiger, Bishop of Speyer, when I wanted to make the village of Speyer into a town, I thought I would increase the honor I was bestowing on the place if I brought in Jews. This is beyond Jews serving an economic function in terms of taxation and cash and fund wars. What Rudiger of Speyer is saying here is something much broader. If you want to stimulate commerce, if I want to turn the village of Speyer into the town of Speyer, I'm going to welcome these Jews. And that's the preface to a series of privileges, he goes on to say. I place them outside the town and some way off from the houses of the rest of the citizens, unless they should be too easily disturbed by the insolence of the Christian citizens, I surrounded them with a wall. He gave them part of the city, a Jewish part, a Jewish quarter of the city, and he surrounded it with a wall. They weren't being locked in. They had the keys to the gate that surrounded, that opened the wall, to get out. They were allowed to come and go as they pleased. Anyone could come and go. This is not Jews being sequestered. This is Jews being protected. This is a privilege, not a punishment. Now, the place of their habitation, and which I acquired justly, that place, I say, I transfer to them on condition that they pay annually 3.5 pounds of Speyer currency for the use of the brethren. I have granted also to them within the district where they dwell, and from that district outside the town, as far as the harbor, within the harbor itself, full power to change gold and silver, and to buy and sell what they please. In other words, Jews have the right to mint coins, to lend money at interest, and to engage in any form of commerce they want. On the one hand, Jews are only allowed to be merchants and moneylenders. Everything else they're not allowed to do. That was already pre-existing. Jews have a broad range of possibilities. Besides this, I have given them land from the church for a cemetery with the right of inheritance forever. This isn't a short-term thing. This isn't an exception. The Rudder of Speyer gave this charter to the Jews of Speyer in 1084. The reason it's significant, and Speyer is just one town. How impactful could it be? The reason it's significant is that 6 years later, in 1090, the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry II, he gave a charter to Jews all over the Holy Roman Empire, which was a big space, and he used the charter of Rudder of Speyer as the template. By the year 1090, Jews throughout the Holy Roman Empire had the right of residence, the right to trade, the right to do business, the right to live in a Jewish quarter. This is economics overriding any theological consideration. And make no mistake, the other Christian clergy in the area were furious with him for doing this. But it wasn't that Speyer was languishing or having gone in debt. Speyer just hadn't reached the level of other towns. It was the lack of recognition, or the lack of glorious urban whatever. Even a tiny group of Jews, in his mind, there was this stereotype, this image, to stimulate commerce and trade. I'm just giving them a few privileges. He would say, this charter of privileges is just a small number of privileges against a larger background of limited toleration. Now, First Crusade took place in 1096. It was becoming more and more difficult for Christians to make pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The journey was dangerous. It was difficult. It was a war to reconquer Jerusalem. And all these knights, they rode off from various parts of Europe to gather and to go and to reconquer Jerusalem and the Holy Land. So it didn't explicitly have anything to do with Jews necessarily. But that First Crusade wound up having disastrous consequences for Jews who lived in Christian Europe. So think about it. The adversary, the enemy in the crusade were Muslims. From a Christian point of view, these non-believers. But the thing is, in Europe, there were no Muslims. The only infidels in Europe were Jews. So Jews were not the target of the First Crusade, but they became the surrogate. In the absence of the actual enemy, Jews were the only other infidels there. And so the First Crusade very quickly devolved into a mass of anti-Jewish violence across Europe. Jewish communities would be attacked, sometimes by crusading knights, sometimes by Christian mobs. Difficult time. You might say, but hadn't they gotten this guarantee of protection from the Holy Roman Emperor? And didn't St. Augustine instruct Christians not to attack Jews? This is a Chrysostom moment. This is an unusual moment, an unusual level of intense piety where they forgot about St. Augustine's instruction. And also, as far as Henry II, the emperor, and the protection he could give, the emperor was really far away. And many of his imperial soldiers were heading off to the Holy Land. The Jews who were relying on imperial protection were vulnerable, and they were attacked. Now, the devastation wasn't permanent. Most of the Jewish communities that were destroyed in 1096 quickly rebuilt. Jews facing this crusader violence, their responses were varied. Their typical response was negotiate with the crusaders, to offer them bribe, anything. Sometimes it wasn't only Jews being attacked. Sometimes these crusaders would attack towns where Jews lived. They would attack Jews and Christians together, in fact, just to plunder. It was kind of lawless. In some cases, there were Jews who converted to Christianity to avoid being persecuted by the Crusades. If you converted and you weren't Jewish anymore, you were basically left alone. You were basically changed sides. There were Jews who didn't want to convert. They were terrified by the Crusader violence. So instead of converting or being captured, they committed suicide. There were Jews who chose what we would call martyrdom. Not only were these Jews killing themselves, there were Jews who killed themselves and their own children to avoid forced conversion. I have to emphasize here that as a religion, as a set of traditions, martyrdom is not a mainstream Jewish idea. There is this Jewish notion called Kiddush Hashem, which means sanctifying the name of God. Not a mainstream idea. Jews are supposed to live and not die. So these instances of martyrdom, especially of martyrdom of an entire family, is very odd. But what it does is it measures how frightening this Crusader violence was. And it's worth noting that the Crusaders, they weren't just killing Jews. They were killing Jews in brutal and painful ways. The Crusader violence went on for a few months. By the beginning of 1097, order was restored. The violence was curtailed not only by the Holy Roman Emperor, by his army, but also by the Pope. Turns out the Pope did not know about this, and when the Pope heard about violence against Jews, was outraged. Do you not remember what Augustine said? Christians are not supposed to kill Jews. And when the violence ended, there were Jews who were forcibly converted to Christianity who wanted to rejoin the Jewish community, convert back to Judaism. And the question came up, should they be allowed to? According to Christian theology, you're not supposed to force someone to convert. But once you become a Christian, even if you were forced, you're a Christian forever. Who leaves the Christian fold? You're not an infidel. You're a heretic, burned in hell for all eternity, which is about the worst thing to be. But the Pope and the Emperor said, actually, we're going to let these Jews go back. The Jews who were forcibly converted were allowed to return to Judaism. It was a remarkable moment, because what the Pope and the Emperor were trying to do in the aftermath of this Crusader violence is to try as best as they could to restore the pre-Crusades status quo. They wanted to restore that balance. The Second Crusade was summoned by a French bishop whose name was Bernard of Clairvaux. In the year 1171, he assembled notables and he made this speech: go and reconquer the Holy Land, but on the way, you are not allowed to harm Jews. He's speaking to the Crusaders themselves. He says, the reasons you can't persecute Jews, and the reasons he gives, they'll look familiar to you because they're Augustine's reasons for tolerating Jews. Jews preserve Scripture. We need Jews around to convert the same reasons, reinstating that status quo. So the First Crusade upset some of that stability, but the powers that be in the Christian world tried to restore some of it. Now, they were successful to a point. After 1096, steadily for centuries, is an upturn of Christian piety and Christian zeal. The less tolerant it becomes of non-Christians like Jews. Now, the 13th century is a crucial century in terms of all of this. A couple of things are going to happen at the same time. We're going to see a different attitude coming from the Pope and from the Church, and from the Vatican. We're going to see also the emergence of more popular animosity towards Jews. First, from a new order of friars, of Christian friars, known as the Mendicant friars. These are the Dominican friars and the Franciscan friars. We'll come back to that in a second. But also we see the emergence of popular antagonism towards Jews. Let me take them one at a time. In the year 1215, Pope, who that year was Innocent III, he convenes this church council known as the Fourth Lateran Council. Like the other councils we've talked about, there are all these different canons and all these different rules. The goal of the Fourth Lateran Council is to make Christian society more Christian. It's motivated by the fact that the popes believed that one of the reasons the Crusades hadn't worked consistently is because they weren't pious. If they were more pious, they might fight better. There were Christians who were moving away from the church. They were becoming more worldly. And the Pope was trying to make Christian society more Christian. Now, when it came to Jews, There were several statutes. The two most important for our purposes are, first, if there is a crusader who borrowed money from a Jewish moneylender, no longer has to pay it back. The other thing is, was too much contact between Christians and Jews. All Jews must wear some kind of distinguishing mark. So in some places it was a star, in some places it was a sash, in some places Jews had to wear this big three-cornered hat. So that's what the Pope did. Mendicant friars. And like I said, these were two new orders of Christians. Mendicant means poor or begging. They believed that the church was materialistic, and they had lost sight of the mission of the church. So the mendicant orders returned to a life of poverty and austerity. It's within the ranks of the mendicant friars there emerged Christian Hebraists. Scholar who has learned the Hebrew language to read the Hebrew Bible in its original. They began to read not only the Hebrew Bible, but they began to read post-biblical Jewish writing. Discussions known as the Talmud, a series of oral discussions between rabbis that went on for several centuries, which was written down in the year 500 CE and became the central text of Jews. After the Bible, the Talmud was the main Jewish text. And it contains discussions of everything. There are legal discussions, there are stories. Here's why this is significant. Most Christians, when they imagined Judaism in the same way that King David was, they didn't realize that there had evolved a whole large, complex tapestry of Judaism, which was post-biblical in nature. So these mendicant friars who became Christian Hebraists, they discovered post-biblical Judaism. So two things: the discovery of post-biblical Judaism, of Talmud, and they were living in a time that was very eschatological. The end of days was near. Now what this led to was but a rethinking of Augustine's terms of Jewish toleration. That the second coming is just a few years away, but we can be a little more, haphazard in the way we preserve Jews. Of course, one's a little more subtle. Hebrew scripture is important, but St. Augustine said nothing about anything post-biblical. Augustine said the Bible is important. He didn't say the Talmud is important, because what we have emerging from the mendicant friars is what we would call an attack on the Talmud. The most extreme forms is there were moments when a Christian king or sovereign would say, I am no longer tolerating the existence of the Talmud, and would collect all volumes of the Talmud and burn them. The most notorious was in Paris in 1240. Less extreme would be the forced sermon. Jews would gather in the synagogue, and they would be forced to listen to a sermon from a Christian preacher who would just attack the ideas of the Talmud as being wrong. A disputation was a public debate where some public debate between a representative of the Jewish community and a representative of the Christian. They're going to debate who's right, which religion is better or right, Judaism or Christianity. But the Jewish scholar who was participating in that debate was told in no uncertain terms, we want you to make your case on behalf of Judaism, but at no point are you allowed to insult anything about Christianity without contradicting anything about Christianity. Not really a fair fight. In the 13th century, there was major disputations. One was the disputation of Paris in 1239. One was the disputation of Barcelona in 1260. In Paris, this disputation, arguing on the Jewish side, was a rabbi whose name was Yechiel of Paris, who was a top-of-the-line Jewish scholar. He did his best. Arguing against him was a Christian scholar whose name was Nicholas Donin. Now, the thing about Donin is, Donin was born and raised Jewish, and he had a rabbinic education before converting to Christianity. So not only was he a Christian Hebraist, he had an insider's knowledge of Judaism and the Talmud. So he knew all the questions to ask Yechiel of Paris, which would really put him on a spot. So very quickly, the disputation of Paris devolved into an inquisition or an interrogation. This guy, who was having to answer question after question after question. And of course, Jews were declared the loser in the disputation. It took place in 1239. A year later, this was the event leading up to the burning of the Talmud in Paris. A disaster for Jews. The disputation of Barcelona was a little bit different. The only disputation of this kind where Jews didn't lose. They didn't win because the king in this case, he genuinely wanted a fair fight. Now, he didn't say to the Jewish scholar you could insult, but he did want both sides to have a fair chance. Arguing on the Christian side was a Christian scholar whose name was Pablo Cristiani, who, like Nicholas Donin, was born Jewish and was well-versed in the Talmud and in Judaism. Arguing on the Jewish side was a rabbi who's Moses Nachmanides. And Nachmanides was one of the greatest ever, probably top 5. It was the shortest of the disputations because they usually went on for a few weeks. After 3 or 4 days, Nachmanides was arguing his case, the case of Judaism, so effectively that the king called it off. These are all examples of how the Talmud is coming under attack. What I want to emphasize is the Talmud under attack is not the same as Jews being under attack. It's not an attack on Jews, their persons. This is simply Jews being told the Talmud is no longer an acceptable document. If you're going to live by the laws of the Talmud, you're going to get harassed. But it didn't translate into any kind of restrictions. So Jews who lived in Barcelona or Paris, they were still more or less living by the restrictions and privileges of Bishop Rudiger and Speyer that he gave earlier. So politically, this didn't have that much of it, but it was part of this growing antagonism. Where it really resonated was in the popular attitudes towards Jews, because these disputations in particular, these were public events. In the days when, let's face it, in the Middle Ages, they didn't have television or social media or movies or books. There was nothing. Hearing a sermon in church was one of the highlights of your week. When I say these were public, everybody was showing up. The Christian masses were watching all of them, where popular attitudes towards Jews begin to become more antagonistic.